The first time I realized my brother was sleeping with my wife, he was standing in my kitchen, holding a coffee mug I bought 10 years earlier. That was the strange thing about betrayal. It rarely arrives looking dramatic. No thunder, no shouting, no lipstick on collars. Sometimes it arrives quietly, wearing familiar shoes, leaning against your counter like it belongs there. I remember the exact mug because Clara had almost thrown it away 3 winters earlier, after the handle cracked slightly near the rim. I kept it anyway, said it still held coffee just fine. She rolled her eyes at me then. "Not everything broken is worth keeping, Daniel." At the time, I thought she was talking about the mug. Now, sitting at the dining table at 6:30 in the morning while my younger brother Victor laughed too comfortably inside my kitchen, I realized she may have been practicing the sentence for years. Rain tapped softly against the window above the sink. The house smelled like burnt toast and expensive perfume. Not Clara's usual perfume. This one smelled warmer, sweeter. I looked up from the newspaper and saw Victor standing too close to her while she reached for the sugar. People who aren't hiding anything understand distance without thinking about it. People hiding something become very careful. Or not careful enough. Victor moved aside half a second too late. Clara avoided looking directly at me when she handed me my coffee. "You're quiet this morning." "I'm 71, I said. "Quiet is one of the few discounts aging gives you." Victor laughed harder than the joke deserved. That bothered me. Not because it was fake, because it sounded nervous. I watched him scratch the back of his wrist 3 times in under a minute. Victor always did that when lying. He'd done it since childhood. Even when we were boys and he stole money from our father's dresser, he scratched that same spot like guilt itched beneath his skin. Some habits survive old age. Some sins do, too. Clara sat across from me, wearing the pale gray sweater I bought her for our 40th anniversary. Her wedding ring rested on the table beside her coffee cup instead of on her finger. That bothered me more than I expected. Not anger, not yet. Just a strange hollowness. Like hearing movement inside a wall and suddenly understanding the house has been rotting long before the sound appeared. "You still coming Sunday?" Victor asked. "For what?" "The family dinner." I stared at him. "My own grandson's birthday?" I asked quietly. "Yes. I believe they'll still allow me to attend." Clara sighed immediately. That sigh, God. After 42 years of marriage, I learned there are many kinds of sighs. Tired sighs, frustrated sighs, lonely sighs. But the worst kind is the sigh someone makes when your presence has become emotionally inconvenient. "You know that's not what he meant," she said. I nodded slowly and drank my coffee. It had gone cold already. That happened more often lately. I'd sit with full cups of coffee and forget to drink them, while everyone around me spoke as though I were furniture that occasionally answered questions. Families rarely notice the exact moment a father becomes background noise. It happens gradually. First, they stop asking your opinion. Then they stop waiting for you at dinner. Then they stop hearing you altogether. By the time they remember you exist, it's usually because they need money. Victor checked his phone. Clara looked at him before she looked at me. Small things, tiny things. But betrayal lives inside tiny things long before it becomes large enough to destroy a family. I folded the newspaper carefully and stood. My left knee hurt from the rain coming in. "Where are you going?" Clara asked. "Garage." "You shouldn't lift anything heavy alone." Funny. For 30 years, nobody minded me carrying the entire family by myself. Now suddenly they worried about my back. The garage smelled like sawdust and cold metal. My old toolbox sat beneath the workbench exactly where I'd left it the previous night. Beside it rested the cedar jewelry box I'd been repairing for my granddaughter Emma. The latch was crooked. I spent nearly 40 minutes fixing it, even though my hands shook more these days. Not from illness, just age. Age humbles men in private before it humiliates them in public. I heard the back door open inside the house, then silence, then low voices. I wasn't trying to listen. That's the truth. People think devastating discoveries happen because someone goes searching for secrets. Most of the time, secrets simply grow careless. Victor's voice came first. He suspects something. Clara answered too quickly. No, he doesn't. A pause. Then Victor again. He watches everything. I stopped moving. Even the rain seemed quieter. Clara lowered her voice after that. But old houses carry betrayal efficiently, especially houses paid for by one man's overtime shifts for 31 years. He's always watching, she whispered. That doesn't mean he understands. I stood motionless beside the workbench while my thumb rested against the broken latch. Then Victor laughed softly. Not nervous this time. Comfortable. Intimate. I still can't believe you stayed this long. Another pause. When Clara answered, her voice sounded tired in a way I hadn't heard before. Habit, she said. Habit. 42 years reduced to habit. I looked down at my wedding ring. The gold had worn thin near the bottom from decades of work. Plumbing repairs, factory machinery, winter construction jobs when the mortgage nearly drowned us in the 80s. I remembered working 16-hour shifts while Clara stayed home with the boys. I remembered missing school plays, missing birthdays, missing funerals. Not because I wanted to. Because survival is expensive when everyone depends on you. Nobody applauds fathers for surviving quietly. They just hand them another bill. Inside the house, Victor said something too muffled to hear clearly. Then Clara laughed. Softly. I hadn't heard that laugh in years. Not with me. Something inside my chest shifted then. Not shattered, not dramatically, just shifted. Like a foundation cracking beneath a house that still looks stable from the street. I realized something painful in that moment. The affair probably hadn't started recently. Affairs that old do not carry nervous energy anymore. They carry routine, practice, emotional familiarity. I suddenly thought about all the weekends Victor started dropping by after his divorce 6 years earlier. All the late-night conversations between him and Clara in the kitchen while I slept upstairs after double shifts. All the holidays she defended him during arguments with the boys. All the moments I ignored, because exhausted men become experts at ignoring what hurts too much to examine. There's a particular loneliness that only older husbands understand. The loneliness of realizing your replacement entered the room long before you noticed anyone leaving. I sat slowly in the worn recliner near the garage wall. The leather cracked softly beneath my weight. My father used to sit there before he died. Sometimes I catch myself staring at the empty space beside it where his boots used to rest. Funny how absence leaves physical shapes behind. Inside the house, footsteps approached. The garage door opened. Clara stood there with her arms folded. You disappeared. I looked at her for several seconds before answering. I was fixing Emma's jewelry box. Oh. She glanced toward the workbench, then toward me. There was caution in her face now, not guilt. Caution. Like she was measuring how much I knew. "You okay?" she asked. Such a simple question. People ask it every day without understanding how dangerous it becomes after betrayal enters a marriage. Because sometimes the truthful answer destroys everything. I smiled gently. The same smile I'd used for decades whenever the family needed reassurance. "I'm fine," I said. And for the first time in 42 years, my wife looked relieved when I lied. 3 days later, Clara forgot her phone on the dining table. That alone meant nothing. At our age, people forget things constantly. Glasses, medications, why they entered rooms, entire conversations sometimes. But betrayal changes ordinary moments into loaded ones, especially when the phone begins vibrating beside your untouched breakfast. I wasn't planning to look at it. I need to believe that even now. There are lines a man crosses only once, and afterward he spends years deciding whether the truth was worth what it cost him. The screen lit up again. Victor. A message preview appeared before fading. "Last night meant more than you think." I stared at the words while the kitchen clock ticked above the refrigerator. Tick, tick, tick. 42 years of marriage condensed into 11 words on a glowing screen. The strange thing was how calm I felt. No rage, no dramatic collapse, just exhaustion. Like my body had finally received confirmation for something my soul already knew. Outside, rainwater slid slowly down the windows. Clara had left 20 minutes earlier for her volunteer shift at the hospital gift shop. She volunteered twice a week now, said it made her feel useful after retirement. Victor somehow started visiting every Tuesday afternoon around the same time. I used to think loneliness had pushed him toward family after his divorce. Now I understood loneliness had probably pushed him toward my wife long before that marriage ever ended. The phone vibrated again. Another message. He noticed us in the garage. "Be careful." This time I picked up the phone. My hand didn't shake. That surprised me most. I unlocked it because Clara still used the same 4-digit code she'd had for years. Emma's birthday. Our granddaughter had become the center of Clara's emotional world somewhere along the line. Children do that to grandparents. They give aging people someone to love without history attached. The messages opened instantly, and there it was. Years. Not months. Years. Photos, conversations, hotel reservations, inside jokes, complaints about me. Thousands of messages stacked neatly like bricks in a wall built slowly enough nobody heard construction happening. I sat down carefully before continuing. The kitchen suddenly felt colder. One message from 2 years earlier stopped me completely. "Sometimes I think he knows and stays anyway because he's afraid to be alone." Victor responded seconds later. "Daniel's always needed someone to need him. That's his weakness." Weakness. I read that word 3 times. Not because it hurt, because it explained everything. My entire life I believed sacrifice made people safer. I thought if I worked harder, gave more, absorbed more pressure, the family would become stronger. But some people don't experience endless sacrifice as love. They experience it as permission. Permission to take more, to respect less, to assume your devotion has no limit. A father's greatest mistake is often teaching his family he can survive anything. Because eventually, they start testing the theory. I kept reading. The affair had apparently started 7 years earlier, during a weekend family trip to Asheville. I remembered that trip. I'd spent most of it helping my oldest son, Michael, settle a business debt after his restaurant nearly collapsed. While I handled bank calls from the hotel lobby, my wife was apparently beginning another life upstairs with my brother. There were messages mocking my habits, my routines, the way I folded laundry, the way I fell asleep in my recliner after dinner. One message from Clara hollowed me out more than the affair itself. Sometimes I look at him and feel nothing at all. I set the phone down after that, not because I couldn't continue, because I suddenly understood something much worse than betrayal. Indifference. Hatred at least acknowledges your existence. Indifference erases it. I sat there for nearly an hour while the coffee beside me turned cold. Again. At some point, the furnace kicked on with a low rumble beneath the floorboards. The house sounded old suddenly, every creak more noticeable, every draft sharper. Funny how quickly a home becomes a building once love leaves it. My eyes drifted toward the hallway where our wedding photograph still hung. Clara wore that small, nervous smile she always had when too many people looked at her. I looked impossibly young beside her, proud, hopeful, certain hard work could protect happiness. I almost pitied that version of myself. Almost. But younger men deserve more compassion than ridicule. They build entire lives before realizing love and loyalty are separate things. The front door opened around noon. Clara entered carrying grocery bags. "Daniel?" she called. "In the kitchen." She walked in smiling distractedly before freezing halfway across the room. Her phone still sat beside me. I watched her notice it, then notice my face, then notice the silence. Some moments change the emotional climate of a marriage forever. This was one of them. "You forgot your phone," I said quietly. Her expression tightened almost invisibly. "Oh." I nodded toward the groceries. "You bought the expensive coffee again." "It was on sale." She stood there waiting, not speaking, not moving. Fear had entered the room now, small but real. People imagine guilt looks dramatic. Usually it looks mathematical, like someone rapidly calculating damage. "Did anyone call?" she asked. "No." Technically true. Messages aren't calls. She slowly placed the grocery bags onto the counter. I noticed she still wasn't wearing her wedding ring. Another tiny thing. Tiny things eventually become entire cemeteries. "You seem tired," she said carefully. "I didn't sleep well." She hesitated, then finally asked the real question hiding underneath everything else. "Is something wrong?" I looked at her, really looked at her. 42 years beside someone creates dangerous familiarity. You memorize the architecture of their face, the meaning behind pauses, the emotional weather behind certain tones. And suddenly I realized Clara already knew that I knew. Not everything, but enough. That was why her shoulders remained slightly tense, why her eyes kept drifting toward the phone, why her breathing sounded shallow. Betrayal changes both people immediately the moment truth enters the room, even silently. I stood slowly and walked toward the sink. "No," I said. "Nothing's wrong." Another lie. This one heavier than the first. Clara watched me carefully. Then something unexpected happened. She relaxed. Not fully, just enough. Enough to reveal something devastating. Relief. Again.
My suffering frightened her less than confrontation. That realization sat heavily inside my chest long after she left the kitchen. Because it meant the marriage wasn't being preserved out of love anymore. Only maintenance. Like keeping an old appliance running because replacing it feels inconvenient. That evening, Michael came over with his wife, Jenna, and their 2 children. The house became loud the way family houses do. Shoes near the doorway, cartoon sounds from the television, Emma running through the hallway carrying the jewelry box I'd repaired. "Grandpa fixed it," she announced proudly. I smiled. Careful with the latch. Clara watched me from across the living room.
Victor arrived 20 minutes later. He hugged everyone casually. Then he hugged Clara. Too briefly to alarm anyone. Too naturally to attract suspicion. But once you see something clearly, your mind can never return to blindness. I noticed everything now. The hidden glances, the private smiles, the way they instinctively positioned themselves near each other during conversation. Michael sat beside me eventually, while the children played nearby. "You okay, Dad?" I looked over. "What makes you ask?" "You seem distant lately." Distant. Interesting word. Families often describe a father's emotional withdrawal as though it appeared from nowhere. They rarely mention the years spent pushing him toward it. "I'm getting old," I said. Michael laughed softly. "You've been saying that for 20 years. I nodded. "Yes." Then I looked around the room, at my wife, my brother, my son, my grandchildren, and I realized something terrifying. Nobody in that house actually knew me anymore. Not truly. They knew what I provided, what I solved, what I paid for, but not me. A man can spend decades inside a family and still die emotionally unseen. Later that night, after everyone left, I walked downstairs to the basement to retrieve an old folder from the filing cabinet behind my workbench. Property deeds, investment accounts, trust documents, every invisible structure holding the family upright. I opened the folder slowly beneath the dim overhead light, and for the first time since discovering the affair, I began wondering what would happen to all of them if I simply stopped protecting everyone. Then I heard footsteps above me. 2 sets, one lighter, one heavier, moving quietly across my living room long after midnight. I stood motionless in the basement beneath the exposed ceiling beams while footsteps crossed slowly above me. The old house carried sound unevenly. Certain boards groaned loudly, while others concealed movement almost perfectly. After 40 years inside that home, I knew exactly where everyone stepped without needing to look. The heavier steps belonged to Victor. The lighter ones belonged to Clara. I checked my watch. 12:43 a.m. Michael and his family had left hours earlier. There was no reason for Victor to still be in my house. I closed the folder carefully and turned off the basement light. Darkness settled around me, except for the faint glow from the stairwell overhead. Then silence, long enough to feel intentional. I climbed the basement stairs slowly, each step deliberate beneath my weight. Halfway up, I heard Clara whisper something too soft to understand. Victor answered quietly. Then another silence, the kind that says more than words. By the time I reached the kitchen doorway, the living room was empty. Only the lamp near the recliner remained on. Yellow light stretched weakly across the carpet. Victor's coat was gone from the chair near the entrance. But Clara still stood beside the window facing the rain outside. She didn't turn around when she spoke. "You're still awake." "So are you." A pause. "I couldn't sleep," she said. Neither could I, but for different reasons. I walked past her toward the sink and filled a glass with water. My reflection looked older tonight. Not physically, just worn differently. There's a specific exhaustion that comes from realizing the people closest to you have been studying your blind spots for years. "You and Victor seem close lately," I said quietly. Behind me, her breathing changed almost imperceptibly. Not enough for denial, enough for caution. "He's family." "Yes." I drank slowly. Rain tapped against the glass. The refrigerator hummed softly nearby. Ordinary sounds, ordinary kitchen. That's what makes betrayal feel unreal sometimes. The world refuses to change around devastating truths. Everything continues functioning normally, while your internal life collapses silently behind your ribs. Clara finally turned toward me. "Why are you asking?" I looked at her over the rim of the glass. "No reason." Another lie. Marriage eventually becomes a conversation between two people pretending not to notice what the other already knows. She studied my face for several seconds. Then she nodded once and walked upstairs without another word. I remained in the kitchen long after the sound of her footsteps disappeared. The clock above the stove read 1:12 a.m. I suddenly remembered another night, almost 30 years earlier, when Michael was 8 and running a fever so high we nearly took him to the hospital. Clara sat awake beside him all night, placing cold towels on his forehead while I drove through a snowstorm searching for an open pharmacy. Back then, if someone had told me this woman would one day betray me with my own brother, I would have laughed. Not because Clara seemed perfect, because shared struggle creates dangerous trust. People who survive poverty together begin believing loyalty naturally grows from suffering. But hardship doesn't always build character. Sometimes it just reveals it slowly. The next morning, Clara acted almost painfully normal. Too normal. That's another thing people misunderstand about affairs. After discovery begins creeping into a marriage, the guilty partner often becomes strangely attentive. Not out of love, out of fear. She made eggs, asked about my knee, touched my shoulder lightly while passing behind my chair. Every gesture felt rehearsed now. Artificial warmth is colder than honest distance. Victor texted her twice during breakfast. I watched the screen light up beside her plate. She flipped the phone over immediately both times, then smiled at me. "You have a dentist appointment Thursday, remember?" I nodded. "You already told me." "Oh." Her eyes lowered briefly. Small mistake. But people hiding large lies often stumble over tiny details because too much mental energy is spent maintaining deception. After breakfast, I drove downtown to meet Harold Bennett. Harold had been my attorney for 26 years. He was 78 now, thin, precise, the kind of man who still wore suspenders and polished his shoes every morning. His office smelled like old paper and cedar wood. "You look terrible," he said when I entered. "Good to see you too." He gestured toward the chair across from his desk. "What happened?" I almost told him immediately. Instead, I stared at the framed photograph behind him, showing Harold and his late wife standing beside a fishing boat sometime in the early 90s. "She died before she could disappoint me," he said suddenly. I looked up. "What?" Harold folded his hands calmly. "I saw the look on your face the moment you walked in." Then he sighed softly. "Marriage trouble?" Funny how older men recognize certain wounds instantly. I sat down carefully. Hypothetically, I began, if someone wanted to restructure assets quietly, how complicated would that be? Harold didn't answer immediately. Instead, he removed his glasses and leaned back slowly. How bad is it? I looked toward the window. Downtown traffic moved steadily below. Normal lives, normal mornings. Somewhere nearby, strangers were probably laughing over coffee while my 42-year marriage quietly decomposed in my chest. Bad enough, I said. Harold nodded once. Then he opened a yellow legal pad. What exactly are you protecting? That question stayed with me, because until that moment, I hadn't realized I was no longer thinking about revenge. I was thinking about preservation. There's a difference. Revenge wants pain. Preservation wants distance. For decades, I built invisible systems holding my family together financially. Investment accounts, property arrangements, quiet debt payments nobody knew existed, Michael's restaurant bailout, my younger son Andrew's gambling debts I secretly erased 5 years earlier, even Victor's condo mortgage after his divorce. Nobody knew the extent of it except Harold. Not Clara, not my sons, not Victor. Families often believe stability appears naturally. They rarely see the exhausted man quietly bleeding beneath the floorboards to keep everyone warm. I want everything reviewed, I said finally. Harold studied me carefully. Does Clara know? No. Should she? I almost laughed. No. He nodded again and began writing notes. We can move several accounts into protected trusts. The lake property too, if necessary. The house? Harold hesitated. That depends what outcome you want. Outcome. Interesting word. As though marriages collapse neatly enough to produce outcomes instead of wreckage. I rubbed my wedding ring slowly. I don't know yet. That was the truth. Because despite everything, part of me still couldn't emotionally reconcile the woman I married with the woman betraying me. Love does not disappear immediately after betrayal. That's the cruel part. Sometimes love survives long enough to watch itself become humiliation. When I returned home around noon, Clara was sitting at the dining table with old photo albums spread around her. For a moment, the sight almost broke me. She looked exactly like the woman I remembered from years ago. Soft afternoon light near the windows, reading glasses low on her nose, fingers turning faded photographs carefully. Then I noticed she quickly closed one album when I entered. Fear again. Always fear now. What are those? I asked. Just organizing old pictures. I walked closer. One photograph sat partially exposed near her elbow. Beach trip, 1998. Victor stood beside Clara holding Michael's youngest daughter while I grilled food in the background, unaware someone had captured the moment. Victor's hand rested lightly against Clara's lower back. Too familiar, too practiced. And suddenly, I realized something that made my stomach tighten. Maybe the affair hadn't started 7 years ago. Maybe 7 years ago was simply when they stopped resisting it. How long has he been here? I asked quietly. Clara looked up too fast. What? Victor. He hasn't. I nodded toward the second coffee cup near the sink, still warm. Another silence entered the room. She followed my eyes, then looked back at me. He stopped by earlier. Of course.
The atmosphere shifted subtly then. Not confrontation, something stranger. Like two people standing near the edge of a truth neither wanted spoken aloud yet. "You've been acting strange," she said carefully. "Have I?" "Yes." I smiled faintly. That usually means someone finally started paying attention. Her expression changed immediately, only for a second, but long enough.
People become most frightened when quiet men stop behaving predictably, because predictable men are controllable. I walked upstairs before she could answer. Inside our bedroom, I opened the nightstand beside my side of the bed. My father's wristwatch rested inside exactly where I always kept it. Broken. Stopped permanently at 2:17 after he collapsed in the garage 20 years earlier. I never repaired it. Some things deserve to remain frozen exactly where they ended. Then I noticed something missing. The small envelope beneath the watch. Gone. Inside that envelope were copies of the original lake house deed and several investment account numbers. Nothing immediately useful alone, but enough to raise questions. Enough to matter. Slowly, I closed the drawer again. And downstairs, I heard Clara speaking softly on the phone. I stood beside the bedroom door, listening to Clara's voice drift faintly upstairs from the kitchen below. Soft, careful, controlled. The tone people use when discussing dangerous things quietly. I moved toward the staircase without making noise. Age teaches you strange skills. Older men learn how to walk through their own homes invisibly because eventually everyone stops noticing them anyway. Halfway down the stairs, I heard Victor's name, then mine. "He's asking questions now," Clara whispered. A pause while she listened. "No, I don't think he knows everything." Another pause, then quieter. But something changed. I stopped moving. The chandelier above the dining room cast pale shadows across the walls. Our family portraits lined the staircase beside me. Christmas photographs, graduations, beach vacations. 40 years of carefully documented smiles. People think photographs preserve memories. Mostly they preserve performances. I heard Victor speaking faintly through the phone speaker. Clara sighed. "I know," she said. "Just stop coming by so often for now." That sentence settled heavily inside me, not because it confirmed the affair, because it confirmed management. They weren't ashamed. They were adjusting strategy. Affairs survive longer than marriages sometimes because they require constant maintenance, constant secrecy, constant emotional calibration. Meanwhile, long marriages slowly assume loyalty no longer needs tending. That assumption kills more families than hatred ever will. I stepped deliberately onto the next stair loud enough for the wood to creak. Clara immediately stopped speaking. By the time I entered the kitchen, she had already lowered the phone from her ear. "Victor?" I asked casually. Her eyes flickered. "Yes." "How's he doing?" "Fine." I nodded toward the sink. "Coffee smells burnt." She stared at me another second before hanging up. "You startled me." "Sorry." "Not sorry." She crossed her arms lightly. "You've been sneaking around lately." Interesting accusation. People hiding betrayal often become hypersensitive to observation. Every glance feels invasive because their conscience already lives in panic. "I live here," I said quietly. "That's not what I meant." I pulled a mug from the cabinet slowly. "No?" Clara watched me carefully. The tension between us had changed shape now. It no longer felt like ordinary marital distance. It felt strategic, measured.
like two people sensing an emotional landslide beneath the floorboards while pretending the house remained stable. "You could just say whatever's bothering you," she said. There it was. Invitation through pressure. Confession bait. Part of her wanted confrontation now because uncertainty was becoming unbearable. But uncertainty was the first honest thing she'd felt in years. So I let it continue. "I'm tired," I answered. "You're always tired lately." I smiled faintly.
Maybe I'm finally noticing. She opened her mouth slightly, as though preparing to say something sharper, then stopped herself. That restraint told me more than anger would have. Clara was afraid. Not of losing me emotionally, of losing stability. That distinction matters. A person who fears heartbreak behaves differently than a person fearing consequences. Later that afternoon, I drove alone to the lake house. The road curved through old pine trees, still wet from rain. I hadn't visited the property in almost 4 months. Not since last autumn, when Michael borrowed it for a weekend anniversary trip with Jenna. I paid for that property 23 years earlier, after working double shifts during a factory expansion project that nearly destroyed my back. Nobody in the family knew the mortgage had never technically been shared. The deed remained solely under my name. Another invisible structure. Another quiet protection nobody appreciated because they never saw it operating. The lake house sat empty near the waterline beneath a gray sky. Small, modest, white paint peeling slightly near the porch railing. Clara used to love this place, back when we still laughed easily, before retirement, before distance, before emotional replacement entered our marriage wearing my brother's face. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. Dust floated through pale light near the windows. The air smelled faintly of cedar and old fabric. Everything remained exactly where we left it months earlier, except for one thing. A wine glass rested inside the sink. I stood still, then slowly looked around. The blanket near the couch had been folded recently. 2 coffee mugs sat drying beside the dish rack. And the bedroom upstairs? I already knew before checking. Still, I climbed the stairs anyway. The bed had been used. Not recently, but enough. My chest tightened strangely then. Not rage. Grief. There's something uniquely humiliating about realizing your own memories were used as decoration for someone else's betrayal. I sat on the edge of the bed staring at the old quilt Clara's mother stitched for us in 1982. I remembered bringing our sons here during summers when money was tight. Fishing lessons, burnt hamburgers, fireflies near the dock. Back then, I believed providing stability created loyalty naturally. But families sometimes become like wealthy nations. The longer peace lasts, the less anyone remembers who sacrificed to build it. I opened the nightstand drawer beside the bed. Inside rested an old receipt. Restaurant, 2 dinners, bottle of wine, 3 weeks earlier. I stared at the date for a long time. 3 weeks ago, Clara told me she was staying overnight with her sister because Margaret had a difficult week. Margaret had actually been in Arizona visiting her daughter that entire month. I knew because I helped pay for the trip. The realization hollowed me out slowly. Not because of the lie itself, because of how easily she told it. Long betrayals change people permanently. Deception stops feeling immoral after enough repetition. It becomes routine, like locking doors before bed. I stood and walked toward the window overlooking the lake. Rain disturbed the water in soft circles. An empty dock stretched quietly into gray distance. I suddenly thought about fathers and husbands in general. How many men spend entire lifetimes believing usefulness guarantees love? It doesn't. Usefulness only guarantees demand. The two are not the same thing. My phone buzzed. Michael. I answered after the third ring. Hey, Dad. Something wrong? No, just checking in. A pause. You sound weird. I almost laughed. Children always notice emotional changes once they fear access to you might change too. I'm at the lake house. Oh. Another pause. You okay? There was genuine concern in his voice this time. That complicated things. Because Michael wasn't cruel. Self-absorbed sometimes. Entitled occasionally. Blind far too often. But not cruel. Families rarely collapse because every member is evil. Usually they collapse because good people become comfortable benefiting from unhealthy dynamics. I'm fine, I said. You sure? Yes. He hesitated, then lowered his voice slightly. Mom's been acting strange too. Interesting. How so? I don't know. Distracted lately. Another pause. Jenna thinks something's going on. My eyes drifted toward the bed behind me. Yes, I said quietly. Something probably is. Silence. Then Michael laughed awkwardly. You two aren't getting divorced at this age, are you? At this age. As though betrayal has expiration dates. I looked out toward the lake again. No, I said finally. But even as I answered, I realized something unsettling. For the first time since discovering the affair, I wasn't sure whether that answer was true anymore. When I returned home after dark, Clara was sitting alone in the living room with the television on mute, waiting. The lamp beside her cast soft light across the carpet. You were gone a long time, she said. I drove to the lake. Something moved behind her eyes immediately. Fear again. Not heartbreak. Fear. Why? I removed my coat slowly. Just wanted to check on the place. Oh. She folded her hands tightly in her lap. You could have told me. I looked at her carefully then. 42 years together, and suddenly every conversation felt like interrogation disguised as marriage. There were wine glasses in the sink, I said quietly. The room changed, instantly. Not dramatically, just enough. Enough to feel oxygen disappear between us. Clara's face lost color almost imperceptibly. Then she recovered. A few weeks ago, Margaret and I stayed there overnight. No, I said softly. You didn't. Silence. Heavy now. Real. The television flickered soundlessly in the corner while rain tapped against the windows. Clara stared at me without speaking. And for the first time since this nightmare began, neither of us pretended anymore. Clara didn't speak for several seconds. Neither did I. The silence between us no longer resembled marriage. It felt like standing inside the ruins of something while both people quietly assessed structural damage. Finally, she looked away first. You went through my things. Interesting. Not denial. Deflection. People cornered by truth often attack the method of discovery because the truth itself has become indefensible. I visited my own property, I said calmly. That's not what I meant. I know. The television continued flickering across her face. Some crime drama. Subtitles moving silently along the bottom of the screen while two fictional people argued in a room full of fake tension. Real tension is quieter than television. Real tension sits motionless in old living rooms while rain taps against windows and 42 years of history suffocate between two people. Clara stood slowly. "You've been watching me." The sentence almost amazed me. After years of betrayal, somehow observation had become my crime. "I've been married to you," I answered. "There's a difference." She crossed her arms tightly. "You're acting paranoid." There it was. Gaslighting. Not dramatic, not obvious, just subtle enough to make a tired man question whether his pain is legitimate. I remembered every previous moment now. Every time Clara dismissed concerns over the years with that same calm tone. Every occasion my instincts noticed emotional distance while she explained it away as stress, aging, hormones, retirement. Manipulation rarely arrives screaming. Usually it arrives sounding reasonable. I sat down slowly in my recliner. The leather creaked beneath me. My father used to say something when I was young. The most dangerous lies are the ones mixed carefully with enough truth to feel merciful. Back then I thought he meant business. Now I understood he meant marriage too. "I'm not paranoid," I said quietly. "I'm paying attention." Clara's jaw tightened slightly. Then, unexpectedly, her expression softened. Not with love, with fatigue. "You think you're easy to live with?" she asked suddenly. I looked at her. There it is. What? The real conversation. She turned away immediately. "I'm tired, Daniel." "No," I said softly. "You're guilty." The word landed heavily. Not explosive, just final. Clara froze near the hallway. For a moment, I thought she might confess. Instead, she whispered something almost too quiet to hear. "You don't know what it's been like." That sentence stayed suspended in the room. Because buried underneath betrayal was another truth neither of us had spoken aloud in years. Our marriage had been lonely, long before it became unfaithful. I leaned back slowly. "What exactly has it been like?" She laughed once without humor. "You were never here." I nodded faintly. "There it is too." Her eyes sharpened. "You think paying bills replaces being present?" "No," I answered honestly. "But paying bills kept everyone alive." "That's not the same thing." "Of course it isn't." We stared at each other across the room, finally speaking truths buried beneath decades of routine. I remembered winters working overnight shifts while Clara slept alone for weeks at a time. I remembered missing anniversaries, missing conversations, coming home too exhausted to notice emotional fractures spreading slowly through the house. But I also remembered who carried everything when money disappeared. When Michael needed tuition. When Andrew crashed his car drunk at 19. When Victor lost his job after the divorce. Me. Always me. A man can fail emotionally while still sacrificing physically. The tragedy is that families usually remember only the failure. Clara sat down on the opposite couch carefully. "We stopped being husband and wife years ago," she said. I studied her face. "Then why stay?" A long silence followed. Too long. Because the honest answer embarrasses people. Security, comfort, fear of instability. Finally, she looked down at her hands. "I didn't know how to leave." There it was. Not love. Inertia. 42 years reduced to mutual habit and financial dependence. I suddenly felt older than I ever had before. You could have divorced me and destroyed the family? I almost smiled at that. Interesting how betrayal suddenly discovers morality when consequences appear. You already destroyed it, I said quietly. Her eyes watered slightly then. Not dramatic tears, just exhaustion leaking through cracks. I never meant for this to happen. Another dangerous sentence. Because affairs don't happen. They are built, protected, fed, brick by brick, choice by choice. How long? I asked. Clara closed her eyes briefly. Daniel, how long? She inhaled slowly. 7 years. The number settled heavily between us, despite already knowing it. Hearing betrayal spoken aloud makes it solid in a different way. 7 years. 7 birthdays. 7 anniversaries. 7 Christmas mornings. 7 years of sleeping beside me while emotionally belonging somewhere else. I looked toward our wedding photograph hanging near the staircase. 42 years beside someone, and apparently the final 7 were counterfeit. Does anyone else know? No. I nodded slowly. Then another question surfaced, one that frightened me more than the affair itself. Did Victor ever feel guilty? Clara hesitated too long. That was an answer enough. Something cold moved through my chest then. Because guilt means someone still sees your humanity. Lack of guilt means they stopped seeing you as emotionally real altogether. He loves you in his own way, she said quietly. I laughed softly before I could stop myself. My own brother. What a pathetic sentence. Families excuse terrible things once they become emotionally invested in maintaining appearances. I stood slowly and walked toward the staircase. Where are you going? Clara asked. Bed. We should talk more. No, I said without anger. You should have talked sooner. Upstairs, our bedroom felt unfamiliar suddenly. The same furniture, same curtains, same framed photographs, but emotionally transformed. Like discovering strangers had been renting space inside my memories. I removed my wedding ring and placed it carefully beside my father's broken watch. The sight unsettled me more than expected. That ring had survived factory work, layoffs, funerals, surgeries, births, debt collectors, and 42 years of ordinary hardship. Turns out ordinary hardship wasn't what killed marriages. Neglect did. Loneliness did. The slow starvation of emotional honesty. Clara entered the bedroom 20 minutes later. I remained sitting on the edge of the bed. She noticed the ring immediately. Don't do that. Interesting. Not, don't leave me. Not, please talk to me. Just don't force reality into physical form. I looked at her quietly. You already removed yours weeks ago. Her face tightened. That's different. No, I said softly. It really isn't. She stood near the doorway, unsure whether to approach me. For the first time in years, I realized Clara no longer understood how to reach me emotionally. Because the man she betrayed had finally stopped protecting her from consequences. I never wanted to hurt you, she whispered. I believed her. That's the complicated part. Most betrayal is selfishness, not sadism. People pursue their own emotional hunger without fully confronting who gets consumed along the way. You did anyway. The room fell silent again. Then Clara asked the question both of us had been avoiding all night. What happens now? I looked toward the rain sliding down the bedroom windows. I honestly didn't know. Part of me wanted divorce. Part wanted disappearance. Part wanted to preserve what little dignity remained. But underneath all of it sat another feeling entirely. Clarity. For the first time in decades, I could suddenly see every invisible structure I'd been maintaining for this family. And I realized something quietly terrifying. If I stopped carrying everyone, almost none of them knew how to stand alone. Then Clara said something that changed the entire shape of the night. "Victor thinks you're going to cut everyone off." I turned slowly toward her. "He said that?" Her expression shifted instantly. Regret. Too late. Much too late. Because suddenly I understood this conversation between her and Victor had gone far beyond an affair. They had discussed me strategically, financially, emotionally, like a problem requiring management. And for the first time since discovering everything, I felt something colder than grief. I felt insulted. I didn't sleep that night. Neither did Clara. You can tell when another person remains awake beside you, even without looking. Breathing changes. Sheets shift occasionally. Small, restless movements ripple through darkness, like thoughts trying to escape the body. At around 3 a.m, Clara whispered my name. I pretended not to hear. Not to punish her. Because I suddenly understood something painful. For years, I had responded immediately whenever anyone in the family needed emotional reassurance. A father's instinct becomes automatic after enough decades. Someone calls your name, you answer. Someone struggles, you fix it. Someone panics, you absorb it. That reflex had built my entire life, and somewhere along the way, everyone began believing my availability belonged to them permanently. Even now, after betrayal, Clara still expected access to my comfort. The room remained dark except for pale rainlight bleeding through the curtains. Eventually, she turned away from me. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the old house settle around us. This house knew everything. Birthdays, arguments, hospital calls, Christmas mornings, silent dinners, affairs. Homes absorb emotional residue like fabric absorbs smoke. By morning, my chest felt hollowed out from exhaustion. Clara moved carefully around the kitchen while making coffee. Too carefully. Like sudden sounds might fracture whatever fragile piece remained. Neither of us mentioned the previous night. That surprised me less than it should have. Long marriages become experts at postponing emotional disasters. I sat at the table reading paperwork from Harold's office while Clara buttered toast mechanically near the counter. "You're going through finances?" she asked eventually. Why?" I looked up briefly. "We're 71, Clara. That never mattered before." "No," I agreed quietly. "It didn't." Her hands stopped moving. Tiny reaction, but enough. Fear again. Every conversation now carried a second, hidden conversation underneath it. At 9:17 a.m., Victor called. Clara stared at the phone ringing on the counter. Didn't answer. It rang again almost immediately. Then again. I watched her finally silence it. Interesting. Affairs become fragile the moment secrecy cracks. Suddenly, every interaction feels dangerous. Every message becomes evidence. "You should answer him," I said calmly. She looked at me sharply. "Why would you say that?" "Because he seems persistent." The color drained slightly from her face. I drank my coffee slowly. Cold already. Always cold lately. That morning, I drove to Andrew's apartment across town.
My younger son lived alone now after his second divorce. 43 years old and still emotionally drifting through life like someone waiting for adulthood to begin later. I had paid his rent 3 times in the past 2 years. He never asked directly anymore. He just sounded stressed during phone calls until guilt did the rest. Parents often mistake rescue for love because rescue feels useful immediately. Love requires boundaries. I learned that too late. Andrew answered the door wearing sweatpants and yesterday's exhaustion. "Dad? You busy?" He frowned. "No." His apartment smelled faintly of stale beer and takeout containers. Television running softly in the background. Laundry piled near the hallway. 43 years old.
Still living like temporary hardship might magically organize itself. He noticed me looking around. Yeah, he muttered. I know. I sat carefully on the couch. How's work? They cut hours again. Andrew rubbed his face tiredly. You here to lecture me? No. That seemed to confuse him, because usually I arrived carrying solutions disguised as concern. This time I carried observation. There's a major difference. He sat across from me eventually. What's wrong? Nothing. Dad. I looked at him quietly. When's the last time you called me without needing something? His expression changed immediately. Defensive first, then guilty. I call you when you need money. That's not fair. Interesting again. People dependent on your sacrifice often become offended when you notice the pattern. I leaned back slowly. Do you know how much I paid toward your debts over the years? Andrew stared at me. What is this about? Answer the question. I don't know. Neither do I anymore. Silence settled between us. I looked around his apartment again. Expensive gaming system, large television, new phone charging beside the couch. Funny how people drowning financially still find ways to purchase comfort while expecting responsibility from someone else. I'm not criticizing you, I said quietly. I'm trying to understand when helping turned into expectation. Andrew looked genuinely unsettled now. Did something happen? Yes. What? I almost told him everything. Instead, I studied his face carefully. My son. A grown man who still looked frightened whenever life stopped cushioning him. No more loans, I said softly. The room changed instantly. Wait, what? No more money. His eyes narrowed. Why? Because you're 43. That's not an answer. It's enough of one. He stood suddenly and walked toward the kitchen, agitated. Children rarely notice financial support emotionally until the possibility of losing it appears. You think I enjoy asking you for help? No, I answered honestly. I think you stopped feeling ashamed about it years ago. That hit him harder than I expected, because shame requires self-awareness, and self-awareness becomes uncomfortable around people who rescue you constantly. Andrew turned toward me sharply. This about Michael? What? You always thought he was more responsible. I sighed quietly. There it was. Old resentment. Families keep emotional ledgers nobody discusses openly. Favoritism, sacrifice, attention, disappointment. Every child remembers different versions of the same father. This isn't about Michael. Then what is it about? I looked toward the window. Gray sky outside. Traffic moving slowly below. My entire life, I said carefully. I solved problems before anyone else had to feel them.
Andrew remained silent.
And eventually, I continued, everyone around me started believing problems disappeared naturally. His face softened slightly then. For a moment he looked less defensive, more confused. "You're scaring me," he admitted quietly. That sentence lingered heavily, because I realized something devastating. My emotional withdrawal frightened my family more than my suffering ever had. Not because they loved me properly, because stability was disappearing. I stood slowly. "You'll figure things out." "Dad." "You will." I walked toward the door before he could continue. Then Andrew said something behind me that stopped me cold. "Mom's been talking to Uncle Victor a lot lately." I turned slowly. He shrugged awkwardly. "Jenna mentioned it too." "How long?" "I don't know." A pause. "Months, maybe?" Months. So people noticed. They simply chose comfort over confrontation. Families do that often. They sense dysfunction quietly and pray someone else absorbs the emotional cost of addressing it. I nodded once and left without another word. Outside, the wind carried the smell of coming rain again. Everything lately smelled like rain. That afternoon, I visited the bank alone. Mrs. Holloway still worked there after all these years. 65 now. Sharp memory. Kind eyes. "Daniel," she smiled. "Haven't seen you in ages." Trying not to. She laughed softly. I spent nearly 2 hours restructuring accounts quietly inside her office. Trust transfers. Access limitations. Emergency authorization removals. Invisible changes. That's how real power shifts happen inside families. Quietly. Legally. Without screaming. Nobody notices foundations moving until cracks appear upstairs. Before leaving, Mrs. Holloway glanced over the paperwork. "This is substantial." "Yes." "You expecting problems?" I thought about Clara, Victor, Andrew. All the invisible dependents woven through my family, like electrical wiring inside walls. Then I remembered something my father once told me, after lending money to a relative who never repaid him. The quickest way to discover whether someone loves you is to remove what you provide. At the time, I thought that sounded bitter. Now I understood it was merely experience speaking honestly. When I arrived home near sunset, Victor's truck sat in my driveway. For several seconds, I simply stared at it through the windshield. My brother's truck, parked confidently outside my house. After everything. I shut off the engine slowly. The ticking sound of cooling metal filled the silence. Then I noticed something else. The kitchen curtains were partially open, and through the window, I could see Clara crying while Victor held her. I stayed in the car longer than I should have. Not frozen, not afraid, just tired in a way that felt cellular. Victor stood inside my kitchen, with one hand resting on Clara's shoulder, while she cried into a dish towel near the sink. From a distance, they almost looked like an ordinary married couple, weathering ordinary pain together. That was the part that hollowed me out most. Not the affair itself anymore. The familiarity of it. The comfort. 7 years was long enough for betrayal to stop feeling forbidden and start feeling domestic. I watched Victor say something softly to her. She nodded. Then he touched her face. Not passionately, not dramatically. Gently. Like a man accustomed to comforting her. I looked away immediately. Funny how the human mind works. You can survive layoffs, funerals, hospital rooms. But there are tiny images that break something permanently because they rearrange your entire understanding of the past. That gesture rearranged mine. I suddenly wondered how many times Clara cried in his arms after arguments with me. How many private versions of our marriage existed inside conversations I never heard. The windshield blurred slightly before I realized rain had started again. Or maybe my eyes had. Hard to tell at 71. Eventually, I stepped out of the car. The cold air helped. By the time I reached the front door, Clara had already moved away from Victor. They were sitting separately now at the kitchen table, pretending distance could still repair appearances. Victor stood when I entered. "Daniel." His voice carried careful neutrality. I removed my coat slowly. "Victor?" Clara wouldn't look directly at me. Interesting. After 7 years of betrayal, eye contact suddenly became difficult only after exposure entered the room. "What's going on?" I asked calmly. Victor glanced briefly toward Clara before answering. She called me upset. "About?" Neither answered immediately. There it was again. That invisible alliance. The tiny instinctive coordination between two people protecting the same secret. "I told him," Clara said quietly. I nodded once. "Clearly." Victor rubbed the back of his wrist. The old nervous habit again. Amazing how age changes people physically while leaving their guilt exactly the same. "I know this looks bad," he began. I laughed softly before I could stop myself. "Looks bad." What a pathetic phrase for something this enormous. "You're sleeping with my wife," I said. "I think we've moved beyond appearances." Silence crushed the room instantly. Some truths become heavier once spoken aloud. Victor lowered his eyes briefly. Clara closed hers. Neither denied it. That hurt more than denial somehow. Because denial at least preserves the illusion someone still cares how deeply you're wounded. Acceptance means they've emotionally moved on from your pain already. "I never wanted this," Victor said carefully. I looked at my younger brother, 59 years old. Divorced twice. Financially unstable for most of his adult life. The same little brother I protected from bullies, helped through college, paid legal fees for after his DUI 20 years earlier. I remembered giving him my winter coat once when we were children because he'd lost his during a snowstorm. Funny the things your mind retrieves during emotional collapse. "You wanted it enough to continue for 7 years, I replied. He swallowed hard. Clara finally spoke. "We didn't plan it." "No," I agreed quietly. "You only maintained it for nearly a decade." The kitchen fell silent except for the refrigerator humming nearby. My eyes drifted toward the fruit bowl in the center of the table. Clara always kept oranges there because Emma liked them after school. Ordinary objects become surreal during family collapse. Everything continues looking painfully normal. Victor leaned forward slightly. "Daniel, listen." "No," I interrupted softly. "You listen." He stopped. And suddenly I realized something important. Neither of them had ever truly heard me before. Not completely. Because I spent decades speaking gently enough to keep everyone comfortable. But there's a quiet authority exhausted men eventually discover once they stop fearing conflict more than loneliness. "I spent my entire life protecting this family," I said calmly. "Including you." Victor's face tightened. "I know." "No," I answered. "You know I paid for things. That's different." Clara stared down at the table. I continued before either could interrupt. "When Dad died, who covered your debts?"
Victor remained silent. When your second marriage collapsed, who paid your condo mortgage for 11 months? His eyes widened slightly. Clara looked up immediately. Interesting. She hadn't known that. There are entire sections of your life, I said quietly, that exist only because I carried them financially. Victor's breathing changed.
You didn't have to do that. There it was. The sentence ungrateful people use when sacrifice becomes uncomfortable to acknowledge. No, I agreed. I didn't. Silence again. Then Clara whispered, "Why are you saying this?" I looked at her for a long moment. Because I finally understand something. Neither spoke. For years, I continued, I thought love meant making myself useful. The rain intensified against the windows. I thought if I solved enough problems, protected enough people, absorbed enough pressure, eventually everyone would feel safe enough to love me honestly. Victor lowered his head. But people get used to rescue, I said. And once they get used to it, they stop seeing the rescuer. Clara's eyes filled slightly again. Not because of the affair, because the truth was becoming impossible to avoid. She had emotionally replaced me long before physically betraying me. The affair was only the visible symptom. Victor stood suddenly. I should go. Of course. Cowards always discover boundaries after exposure arrives. You should have gone 7 years ago, I said quietly. He flinched. Good. Not because I wanted revenge, because consequences had finally entered the room. Victor grabbed his coat slowly. Then he stopped near the doorway. Daniel, I never wanted to hurt you. I stared at him, my own brother, and I realized something cold and final then. He meant it. That was the horrifying part. Neither of them considered my pain important enough to outweigh their own emotional desires. Selfishness often operates without cruelty, which somehow makes it worse. Get out, I said softly. Victor nodded once and left without another word. The front door closed. Then only rain remained. Clara stayed seated at the table motionless. I could feel the emotional shape of the house changing around us now. Rooms carrying different meanings. Hallways feeling unfamiliar. Homes become haunted long before anyone dies. I'm sorry, she whispered eventually. I sat across from her slowly. No, I answered honestly. You're afraid. That hit her harder than shouting would have, because it was true. Fear had finally arrived now that stability itself felt threatened. What does that mean? She asked quietly. It means if I lost everything tomorrow, you would have left years ago. Tears slid down her face then. Real tears. But grief and guilt are not the same thing. And older men learn too late that tears often arrive after consequences, not before betrayal. I did love you, she whispered. Did. Past tense. I noticed immediately. So did she. Her face collapsed slightly after realizing what she'd said. I leaned back slowly in my chair. 42 years. Reduced to grammar. You should go upstairs, she said weakly. Why? You look exhausted. I almost smiled. There it was again. Caretaking arriving only after destruction. I am exhausted. Not physically, existentially. There's a specific fatigue that comes from realizing your entire emotional role inside a family was conditional. I stood carefully and walked toward the living room. Then I stopped beside the hallway photograph wall. Vacation pictures, school portraits, anniversary dinners. A visual history of a family that no longer existed. Clara appeared behind me quietly. "What are you doing?" I stared at one photograph in particular. Summer 2004, the lake house. Victor standing beside Clara again while I grilled food near the dock. That same comfortable distance between them. That same hidden familiarity. My stomach tightened. "How long?" I asked softly. She looked confused. "How long what?" I pointed at the photograph. Her face lost color instantly. Not 7 years. Longer. Much longer. And suddenly Clara looked not guilty, but terrified. Clara stared at the photograph like it might somehow change if she looked hard enough. It didn't. Neither did the truth sitting silently between us. I held the frame carefully in both hands, while rain moved across the windows behind us. Victor stood in the picture beside her, wearing a faded blue t-shirt I remembered lending him that summer after he spilled beer on his own clothes during the barbecue. I remembered the entire weekend suddenly. Michael teaching Emma to fish off the dock. Andrew drunk by noon. Clara laughing more than usual. Victor and Clara disappearing together early one morning to buy groceries in town. At the time, I never questioned it, because trust makes fools of decent men. "How long?" I repeated quietly. Clara's lips parted slightly, then closed again. That silence answered me before words ever could. Not 7 years. Maybe not even 10. Something deeper, older. A slow, emotional betrayal stretching backward through years I still considered real. "I don't know," she whispered finally. I looked at her. "What does that mean?" Tears gathered again in her eyes. "I don't know when it became what it became." There are sentences people use when they cannot survive the honesty required for clearer ones. I set the photograph back against the wall carefully. "When did you first kiss him?" She closed her eyes immediately. That reaction told me enough. "A long time ago," she admitted. "How long?" Another pause, then, "After your surgery." The room tilted slightly around me. My surgery. The spinal injury from the factory accident. I remembered those months vividly now. Painkillers, physical therapy, learning how to walk without grimacing. Clara helping me shower when I could barely stand properly. Victor visited often during that period. Too often. I thought he came because he was worried. I laughed once under my breath. Not humor. Recognition. "What's funny?" Clara asked softly. "I defended you." She frowned slightly. "To everyone." I looked toward the dark kitchen beyond the hallway. Michael once asked if something felt different between us after my surgery. Her expression changed instantly. "I told him marriage changes with age." I smiled faintly. I actually lectured him about loyalty. Clara covered her mouth briefly. The tragedy of betrayal isn't just the cheating. It's discovering how many memories were quietly contaminated while you still protected the people poisoning them. I walked into the living room slowly and sat in my recliner. The old leather groaned beneath me. Clara remained standing near the hallway uncertainly. For the first time in our marriage, she no longer understood what role she occupied beside me. Wife? Caretaker? Stranger? Funny how quickly identity collapses once trust disappears. "I never stopped caring about you," she said after a while. I looked at her calmly. You stopped respecting me. That landed harder, because respect dies long before affection does. People can still feel tenderness towards someone they fundamentally devalue. That's what happened to us. I saw it clearly now. Somewhere during the years I spent surviving, working overtime, carrying debts, fixing disasters, I slowly transformed in Clara's mind from husband into infrastructure. Necessary, reliable, emotionally backgrounded, like electricity inside walls. Nobody thanks it until it disappears. She sat carefully on the couch across from me. I was lonely too. I know. You don't understand how empty things became. I nodded slowly. You think I wasn't empty? That silenced her. Because loneliness inside marriage rarely belongs to one person alone. The difference is that some people endure loneliness, while others escape it through betrayal. I rubbed my forehead tiredly. The room felt dimmer tonight. Older. I used to sit in parking lots after work, I said quietly. Clara looked up. What? For years. I stared toward the dark television screen, sometimes 30 or 40 minutes before coming home. Her face softened slightly with confusion. Why? Because everyone needed something from me the moment I walked through the door. Silence. I'd sit there listening to the engine cool down, I continued, trying to gather enough energy to be useful again. Clara stared at me like she'd never heard my voice properly before. Maybe she hadn't. Men like me become dangerously skilled at hiding exhaustion because collapse feels selfish when people depend on you. I didn't know that, she whispered. No, I agreed. You didn't. That sentence carried 40 years inside it. Not accusation, just truth. The clock above the fireplace ticked steadily while rain softened outside. Eventually, Clara spoke again. Victor listened to me. There it was. The explanation people always offer after betrayal, as though emotional attention justifies destruction. I nodded faintly. He also listened while borrowing money from me for 20 years. Her face tightened. You keep bringing up money. Because everyone else stopped bringing up sacrifice. The room fell quiet again. Then Clara asked carefully, What are you going to do? I thought about Harold's paperwork sitting inside my briefcase upstairs. The trusts, the account protections, the legal changes already beginning quietly beneath the surface. Invisible foundations shifting. I don't know yet, I answered honestly. That frightened her more than anger would have. Because uncertain men become unpredictable. And unpredictable men are harder to manipulate emotionally. Later that night, Clara went upstairs alone around 11. I remained downstairs in the dark living room. At some point, the rain stopped entirely. The house sounded unnaturally still afterward. I stared at the photograph wall again from across the room. A lifetime displayed in frames. But once deception enters memory, every image becomes unstable. You start studying old smiles differently, old vacations, old holidays, searching for the exact point where love quietly became performance. Around midnight, my phone buzzed. Victor. I considered ignoring it. Instead, I answered. Daniel? His voice sounded strained. What? A long pause, then, She told you everything? Interesting wording. Not the truth, everything, meaning there was more. No, I said quietly, but I suspect you're about to. I heard him exhale heavily. You should let me explain. Explain what? Another silence. Then the sentence arrived, the one that changed everything. It wasn't just Clara. My chest tightened slowly. What does that mean? Victor sounded suddenly older than I'd ever heard him. 12 years ago, he said carefully. Andrew found out. The room went completely still. My younger son, Andrew. I gripped the phone harder. How? He saw us together at the lake house. I closed my eyes briefly. 12 years. 12 entire years my son carried this knowledge while looking me in the face across dinner tables and Christmas mornings. What did you tell him? Victor hesitated. Then, that it was complicated. I almost laughed. Families destroy themselves with phrases like that. Complicated. Difficult. Messy. Soft words designed to smother moral clarity. And he said nothing? I asked quietly. No. Why? Victor's answer came immediately this time. Because he was afraid you'd cut him off financially. The words hit with surgical precision, not because they sounded cruel, because they sounded believable. I leaned back slowly in the recliner while darkness pressed against the windows around me. My own son. Protecting an affair to preserve access to money. Suddenly, dozens of moments rearranged themselves inside my head. Andrew acting uncomfortable whenever Victor visited. Avoiding eye contact during certain family dinners. His strange defensiveness earlier that day. Children learn quickly which truths threaten survival. And apparently my son learned mine had a price tag attached. I'm sorry, Victor whispered. I stared into the dark living room for a long time before speaking. No, I said softly. You're scared. Then I ended the call. The silence afterward felt enormous. I looked again at the family photographs lining the wall. And for the first time in my life, I genuinely could not tell which memories belonged to me anymore. I stayed downstairs until nearly 4 a.m, not thinking. Thinking implies movement. This felt more like drowning quietly beneath memory. The house sat around me in complete silence except for the ticking clock above the fireplace. Every few minutes, the heater clicked on, and warm air moved faintly through the vents, carrying the familiar scent of dust and old wood. Home. Funny word. I used to believe a home was built from years of sacrifice. Now I wondered if homes were really just places where people learned how much of themselves they could hide from one another. At 4:13 a.m., I stood and walked slowly toward the kitchen. My knees hurt badly tonight. Age always chooses terrible moments to remind you that your body is temporary too. I filled a glass with water and stared out the dark window above the sink. My reflection looked ghost-like against the glass. Older than 71. Older than grief. 12 years. Andrew had known for 12 years. That truth unsettled me more deeply than the affair itself because it revealed something worse than betrayal. It revealed adaptation. My family had adapted to deception so completely that protecting appearances became more important than protecting me. I thought about Andrew at 31, discovering his mother with my brother at the lake house. What expression crossed his face? Shock? Disgust? Calculation? And eventually, apparently, fear. Fear that honesty might interrupt financial support. That realization sat heavily inside my chest, because it meant my love had slowly transformed into leverage without me noticing. The next morning, Clara found me asleep in the recliner around 7. You stayed down here? I opened my eyes slowly. Sunlight pushed weakly through the curtains. My neck ached from sleeping upright. Apparently, she stood there awkwardly holding her coffee mug with both hands. There was something tragic about her lately. Not because I pitied her, because guilt had finally stripped away the emotional certainty she'd been living inside for years. Affairs feel exciting until consequences demand daylight. "We should talk about Andrew," I said. Her face drained immediately. So she knew. Of course she knew. "How much did Victor tell you?" "Enough." She sat down carefully on the couch opposite me. The distance between us felt deliberate now, measured, like strangers navigating emotional debris. "He was young," she whispered. "He was 31. "That's still young for something like this." I laughed quietly. Not humor, just disbelief. Amazing how betrayal always discovers nuance once accountability arrives. "When exactly were you planning to tell me my son helped hide your affair?" Clara looked down at her hands. "We never wanted him involved. But once he was, everyone decided my ignorance mattered more." Her eyes filled again. I was beginning to resent tears, not because they were fake, because they arrived so late. "There were times I wanted to stop," she admitted softly. I studied her for several seconds. "But you didn't?" "No." The honesty almost hurt worse. I rubbed my face slowly. Sleep deprivation sharpened everything into something metallic and ugly. "I keep thinking about ordinary days," I admitted quietly. Clara looked up. "What?" "Birthdays, family dinners, holidays." I stared toward the dining room. All those moments when everyone sat together pretending to be a family while carrying different versions of reality. Silence. "That kind of thing changes people," I continued. "It changed me too," she whispered. I looked at her calmly. "No," I said softly. "You chose the change." That ended the conversation. Not because she had no response, because somewhere deep down, she knew I was right. There's a difference between being damaged by loneliness and granting yourself permission to damage others because of it. Around noon, Michael arrived unexpectedly. The moment I opened the front door, I knew something was wrong. He looked tense, distracted. "Can we talk?" I stepped aside silently. Clara appeared in the hallway immediately after hearing his voice. The atmosphere changed the second he saw her face. Children always know when their parents have crossed into dangerous territory emotionally. "What happened?" he asked carefully. Neither of us answered immediately. Michael looked from me to Clara. Then understanding slowly entered his expression. Not full understanding, but enough. "Oh my God," he whispered. Clara closed her eyes briefly. "Michael." "No," he interrupted. "What happened?" I walked into the living room without answering. Part of me suddenly felt exhausted by explanations. Michael followed behind me. "Dad?" I sat down heavily in the recliner. "Your mother and Victor have been having an affair." The sentence landed brutally, because simple truths always do. Michael froze completely, then looked toward Clara standing near the hallway. "No." She didn't deny it. That silence shattered him faster than any confession. "How long?" he asked quietly. Clara couldn't answer. I did. 7 years physically, I paused. Longer emotionally. Michael staggered backward slightly and sat down hard on the couch like his legs stopped trusting him. "That's impossible." Funny thing about betrayal. It always feels impossible to the last person informed. "I'm sorry," Clara whispered. Michael stared at her in disbelief. "Uncle Victor?" Nobody answered. He rubbed both hands across his face violently. Emma and Noah were supposed to come over later that evening. Jenna had apparently sent Michael alone first because something felt off. Women notice emotional fractures early. Men usually wait until collapse becomes visible. "Does Andrew know?" Michael suddenly asked. The room went still. Clara's breathing changed instantly. Michael looked at both of us carefully. Then realization hit him too. "Oh my God." I said nothing. That was answer enough. Michael stood again immediately. "That little coward knew?" Interesting. Not sadness first. Anger. Because betrayal creates instant hierarchies of loyalty inside families. "He found out years ago," I said quietly. "And said nothing?" "No." Michael began pacing. "He let me sit at dinners with them? Holidays? Birthdays?" He looked physically sick now. Jesus Christ. I watched him unravel slowly. And despite everything, I felt sorry for him. Because discovering your family has been emotionally staged for years destabilizes reality itself. You start questioning every memory automatically, every laugh, every argument, every silence. Michael stopped pacing eventually and looked at me carefully. "You knew already?" "Yes." "How long?" "A few days." His expression tightened with guilt immediately. "You've been dealing with this alone?" Interesting again. Even now, Michael instinctively assumed I would carry emotional weight quietly by myself, because that had been my role his entire life. Before I could answer, the front door opened. Andrew walked inside carrying a grocery bag, then froze. The moment he saw Michael's face, he understood. Fear spread across him instantly. Raw. Animal. "What's going on?" Nobody answered. Michael turned toward him slowly. "You knew." Not a question. Andrew's eyes flickered toward me, then Clara, then the floor. That was enough. Michael exploded first. "You pathetic little bastard." "Michael." 12 years?" he shouted. "You knew for 12 years?" Andrew's voice shook immediately. "It wasn't my place." "Bullshit." Clara stepped forward. "Stop yelling." Michael laughed harshly. "Now yelling matters?" The room fractured completely then. Andrew began defending himself desperately. Clara crying, Michael pacing, voices overlapping. And through all of it, I suddenly felt detached, like I was watching strangers destroy a house I used to live in. Nobody noticed when I stood up. Nobody noticed when I walked slowly toward the hallway. Because families in collapse become consumed by their own emotional survival. At the staircase, I stopped and looked back once. My wife, my sons. 40 years of history screaming at itself inside my living room. Then my eyes drifted toward the framed photograph wall again, and I realized something devastating. Every person in that room feared losing something from me. Except me. I was the only one who had already lost everything. Then Andrew said something behind me that made the entire house go silent. I thought Dad already knew because of the life insurance policy. I turned slowly. What policy? Andrew's face went white instantly. Too late. Much too late. Nobody spoke. Not immediately. The silence after Andrew's sentence felt unnatural, like the house itself had stopped breathing. Michael stared at him first, then Clara, then me. "What life insurance policy?" I asked quietly. Andrew looked trapped now, truly trapped. His eyes darted around the room, searching for escape routes that no longer existed. What policy?" My voice stayed calm. That frightened him more. Children fear quiet disappointment from fathers far longer than they fear shouting. Andrew swallowed hard. "There was paperwork," he muttered weakly. "What paperwork?" Clara stepped forward suddenly. "Andrew, stop!" Interesting. Panic now. Real panic. I turned toward her slowly. "What paperwork, Clara?" She looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. Not guilt, not sadness, cornered fear. Michael looked between us rapidly. "What the hell is happening?" Nobody answered him. I walked back into the living room carefully and sat down again. My knees ached sharply today, but I barely noticed. "Start talking," I said. Andrew rubbed both hands over his face. 12 years ago, after Dad's surgery." His voice trembled badly. I remembered the surgery vividly now. The spinal injury. Months barely able to walk. Doctors discussing permanent nerve damage while Clara sat beside my hospital bed, pretending devotion. Apparently Victor was sleeping with her during that same period. "You thought I was going to die," I said softly. No one denied it. That realization settled into me slowly, not dramatically, just heavily. Clara sat down suddenly like her legs weakened beneath her. "It wasn't like that." I looked at her calmly. "How was it?" She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Because sometimes the truth becomes too ugly even for liars to reshape. Andrew finally spoke again. "There was a policy update." I frowned slightly. "What update?" Another terrible silence. Then Michael understood before I did. His face changed instantly. "Oh my God." I looked toward him. "What?" He stared directly at Clara. "You changed the beneficiary." The room tilted emotionally then. Not physically, just internally. I felt something inside me detach quietly from the last remaining illusion that this situation still belonged inside ordinary marital failure. Clara's eyes filled immediately. "Daniel, you changed my life insurance policy?" "It was temporary." I almost smiled. Temporary betrayal, temporary lies, temporary theft. Amazing how language tries to softening ugly things once exposure arrives. "To who?" No answer. I asked again. "To who?" Clara looked down. "Victor." Michael swore under his breath. Andrew closed his eyes. And suddenly the room made sense in an entirely different way. The secrecy, the fear, Victor's panic about finances, Clara mentioning he worried I would cut everyone off. Because somewhere along the line, my death had quietly become part of their emotional calculations. I sat perfectly still while the clock above the fireplace ticked steadily. Tick, tick, tick. "I changed it back," Clara whispered quickly. "Interesting. Not denial. Never denial anymore." "When?" "A year later." "Why?" Her tears finally fell again. "Because I realized how horrible it was." I nodded slowly, and strangely enough, I believed her. That was the terrifying part. People rarely become monsters overnight. They drift, one compromise at a time, one rationalization at a time, until eventually they wake up inside actions they no longer recognize as their own. Michael looked physically sick. You made Uncle Victor beneficiary on Dad's life insurance after his surgery? Clara buried her face briefly in her hands. It wasn't supposed to mean anything. That sentence echoed through me. Nothing reveals moral collapse faster than hearing someone describe devastating choices as meaningless. I looked toward Andrew. And you knew. He nodded weakly. I found the paperwork by accident. When? While helping Mom organize documents. 12 years. 12 entire years my younger son carried knowledge that his mother had once prepared financially for my death while sleeping with my brother. I suddenly remembered Andrew acting strangely attentive during my physical therapy recovery back then, hovering near me constantly, offering help, watching me carefully. At the time, I thought it was concern. Now I realized it was guilt. Children forced into adult betrayal age internally in strange ways. Michael started pacing again. This family is insane. Nobody argued. He pointed toward Clara. You cheated on Dad with his brother while he could barely walk? Stop, she whispered. No. Michael's face twisted with disbelief. He almost died. That sentence hung heavily in the room. Because it was true. The doctors warned Clara privately that complications from the surgery could leave me permanently disabled. I remembered the fear in her eyes back then. Apparently, fear pushed her toward Victor instead of toward me. There's a brutal truth about human beings most people avoid admitting. Some people run toward comfort the moment responsibility becomes frightening, even if it destroys someone else. I leaned back slowly in the recliner, suddenly exhausted again. Not angry, past anger now. This felt colder, like emotional frost spreading quietly through old structures. Dad, Andrew whispered carefully. I'm sorry. I looked at him, my younger son, 43 years old, still looking terrified of disappointing me, and I realized something heartbreaking. Andrew never matured emotionally because everyone around him spent decades hiding consequences from him, including me, especially me. What exactly are you sorry for? I asked quietly. His mouth opened slightly, closed again, because there were too many answers. Sorry for silence. Sorry for cowardice. Sorry for protecting financial stability over truth. Families built around one man's endless sacrifice eventually produce emotional dependence. People who confuse protection with permanence. Michael stopped pacing eventually. Then he looked directly at me. What are you going to do? Interesting question. Nobody asked how I felt anymore, only what came next. That's what families do during collapse. Survival instincts replace empathy quickly. I stared at the wedding photograph near the hallway. Two young people believing love alone could survive adulthood. I almost pitied them now. I don't know, I answered honestly. Clara looked terrified by that answer again. Uncertainty had become more frightening to them than truth itself. Because as long as I remained predictable, they could still emotionally manage me. Then my phone rang. Harold. I answered quietly. Daniel. You alone? No. A brief pause. The trust transfer completed this morning. The room changed instantly, even though nobody else knew exactly what he meant. Still, people recognize dangerous sentences intuitively. Thank you, I said calmly. You sure about all this? I looked around the room slowly, at Clara, Michael, Andrew, my family, or whatever remained of it. Yes, I answered. Harold lowered his voice slightly.
One more thing. Victor contacted my office yesterday.
Every nerve in my body sharpened instantly. What?
He wanted information about the estate structure.
A pause.
Claimed Clara asked him to help organize things.
The room went completely still. I stared directly at Clara now. Her face had already lost color.
She what?
Michael whispered.
Harold continued speaking through the phone. I told him nothing, obviously. But Daniel,
he hesitated.
You should understand something.
What?
He sounded very concerned about access.
Access. Not grief. Not family. Not marriage.
Access. Money reveals emotional truth faster than betrayal ever does. I thanked Harold quietly and ended the call. Then I looked at Clara. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Finally, she whispered, "I can explain." And for the first time since this nightmare began, I realized I no longer wanted explanations. I wanted distance. The strangest part about emotional collapse is how ordinary the body remains through it. My heart still beat steadily. My lungs still worked. My knees still ached when I stood. Meanwhile, somewhere deeper, 42 years of marriage were turning to ash quietly beneath my ribs. Michael left first. Not angrily, just stunned beyond language. At the front door, he stopped and looked back at Clara like he no longer recognized her properly. "I don't even know who you are anymore." Then he walked out into the rain without waiting for an answer. Andrew stayed behind awkwardly near the dining room, staring at the floor like a child waiting for punishment. Clara sat motionless on the couch, and I suddenly realized something devastating. Everyone in the room was waiting for me to stabilize the situation emotionally. Even now, even after everything. Families become addicted to certain roles: the responsible one, the forgiving one, the one who absorbs impact so everyone else survives intact. I was tired of being structural support for people who only noticed me when foundations shook. "I think you should leave too," I told Andrew quietly. His head snapped up immediately. "What?" "You heard me." "Dad, not forever." I rubbed my forehead slowly. "Just leave." Fear crossed his face instantly. Real fear. Children know when fathers finally stop protecting them emotionally. The atmosphere changes in ways impossible to fake. "Are you serious?" "Yes." Andrew looked toward Clara desperately. "Interesting." Still searching for another adult to rescue him from consequences. "Mom?" She barely looked at him. "I think you should go." That wounded him more than my words did. Because despite everything, Andrew still believed his mother would soften reality for him somehow. He grabbed his jacket slowly. At the doorway, he paused. "I was scared," he whispered toward me. I looked at him quietly. So was I. He left crying. Not loudly. Just small, broken sounds he tried unsuccessfully to hide while closing the front door behind him. Then only Clara and I remained. The silence afterward felt enormous. A marriage reduced to two exhausted people sitting in separate corners of a dim living room, surrounded by framed evidence of a life neither fully understood anymore. Finally, Clara spoke. You think I'm evil now? I considered the question carefully. No, I answered honestly. I think you became selfish slowly and stopped noticing. That hurt her. Good. Not because I wanted cruelty. Because clarity matters more than comfort once a family starts collapsing. She stared at her hands for a long time. Victor made me feel seen. There it was again. The same explanation. Emotional visibility. I understood it better than she realized. The tragedy was that I knew exactly how invisibility felt too. But I endured mine alone instead of turning someone else into collateral damage. You know what's strange? I said quietly. She looked up. For years, I thought being needed meant being loved. Her face softened slightly. But they're not the same thing. Rain moved gently against the windows again. I continued before she could respond. People needed my paycheck, needed my problem solving, needed stability. I looked toward the dark hallway. But very few people actually saw me once usefulness became routine. Clara's eyes filled again. You think Victor saw me? She whispered. I studied her carefully. For the first time since discovering everything, I saw something beyond guilt in her expression. Disillusionment. Affairs survive partly because they exist outside ordinary life. No bills, no exhaustion, no decades of accumulated disappointment. But eventually fantasy collides with practical reality. And then people discover they weren't escaping loneliness. They were borrowing distraction. You loved the version of yourself you became around him, I said quietly. That's different from love. She looked shattered by that. Because deep down, I think she already knew. Around 6 that evening, my phone buzzed again. Victor. I ignored it. Then another message arrived. Please let me explain everything. I stared at the screen for several seconds before setting the phone face down on the table. Clara watched silently. You should answer him. No. He's scared. I almost smiled. Good. That ended the conversation. Later that night, I went upstairs and opened the closet slowly. Clara's clothes hung beside mine exactly as they had for decades. The intimacy of shared closets suddenly felt unbearable. I pulled an old suitcase from the shelf. Clara appeared in the doorway immediately. What are you doing? I folded shirts carefully onto the bed. I'm leaving for a few days. Her face changed instantly. Panic. Not emotional sadness this time. Abandonment panic. Where? Lake House. Daniel, please don't do this. Interesting phrase. As though this began with my departure instead of years of deception. I continued packing calmly. You said yourself we stopped being husband and wife years ago. That's not what I meant. No, I agreed quietly. It usually isn't. She stepped closer. I don't want this marriage to end. I looked up slowly. That sentence deserved honesty. Then you should have protected it. Her expression collapsed completely after that. Because there was nothing left to argue against. People don't accidentally preserve marriages for 40 years. They choose it repeatedly, or they stop choosing it. Clara sat on the edge of the bed suddenly and buried her face in her hands. For a moment, she looked genuinely old. Not physically, spiritually. Like the weight of her own choices had finally become visible to her all at once. I ruined everything, she whispered. I zipped the suitcase slowly. "No," I said quietly. "We ruined things long before the affair." She looked up sharply. "But you destroyed whatever was left." That distinction mattered. Our marriage had been starving for years, but she chose betrayal instead of honesty, and now everyone would live inside the consequences. As I reached for my coat, Clara suddenly grabbed my wrist. The contact startled both of us. Her hand trembled slightly. "Please don't disappear from me." That sentence nearly broke something inside my chest. Because after all this time, that was the closest thing to truth she'd offered. Not love, not excuses. Fear. Fear of emotional abandonment. Fear of losing the one person who spent decades carrying her life quietly behind the scenes. I looked down at her hand on my wrist, then gently removed it. "You disappeared first," I said softly. The drive to the lake house took nearly 2 hours in heavy rain. Dark roads, dim headlights, old songs playing softly through static-filled radio stations. I kept thinking about my father. After my mother died, he once told me something strange while sitting in his garage sharpening fishing hooks. "Loneliness isn't when nobody loves you," he said. "It's when nobody knows what you've survived." At the time, I didn't fully understand him. Now I did. Perfectly. When I finally reached the lake house, the rain had weakened to a soft mist drifting across the water. I unlocked the front door slowly. Cold air greeted me from inside. The place still carried traces of them. Wine, perfume, memory. I stood alone in the dark living room, listening to the lake move softly beyond the windows. Then I noticed something immediately. The upstairs bedroom light was on. I froze. I distinctly remembered turning every light off before leaving days earlier. Slowly, I set my suitcase down beside the door, and then I heard movement upstairs. The sound upstairs stopped the moment I noticed it. That was somehow worse, because accidental noises continue naturally. Intentional silence means someone else knows you're there too. I stood motionless inside the dark lake house entryway while mist drifted across the windows overlooking the water. My pulse remained strangely calm despite everything. At 71, fear changes shape. You stop fearing violence. You start fearing what people are capable of emotionally. The upstairs floor creaked once. Careful movement. I reached beside the doorway and turned on the lamp near the couch. Soft yellow light spread through the room. Nothing looked disturbed downstairs. The blanket remained folded near the recliner. 2 old fishing rods leaned against the wall beside the fireplace. A framed photograph of Clara and me from 1996 still sat crookedly on the bookshelf. Younger, suntanned, laughing. I looked away from it immediately. Another creak upstairs. Then a voice. "Daniel?" Victor. Of course. I closed my eyes briefly. Not from shock anymore, just exhaustion. He appeared at the top of the staircase a moment later, wearing jeans and an old gray sweatshirt. Comfortable. At home. That bothered me more than anything. My brother descended the stairs slowly while studying my face carefully. "I didn't think you'd come tonight." Interesting sentence, meaning he came expecting access to this place without me. "How did you get in?" He hesitated, then reached into his pocket slowly and held up a key. The old brass lake house key. My chest tightened instantly. Not because the key existed, because I never gave him one. I looked at it for several seconds before asking quietly, "Did Clara?" Victor nodded once. "How long ago?" Another hesitation. "A few years." A few years. The phrase almost made me laugh. People involved in long betrayals lose all perspective on time. Years become casual measurements. Entire sections of someone else's life reduced to vague timelines and nervous shrugs. I removed my coat carefully and hung it near the door. Victor watched me uneasily. "You shouldn't be here," I said. "I know." "Then why are you?" He looked around the lake house slowly before answering. "I didn't know where else to go." There it was. Victor's real talent. He always positioned himself emotionally near whoever provided shelter. As children, it was our mother. As adults, it became me. Then Clara. Some people survive life by attaching themselves quietly to stronger structures. I walked toward the kitchen. "You staying here now?" "No." "Then why's the bedroom light on?" He rubbed his wrist again, nervous. I came to think. I almost smiled. Men like Victor only start thinking after consequences arrive. I filled a glass with water from the sink while he remained standing awkwardly near the staircase. Rain tapped softly against the roof. The lake moved gently outside. "I told Clara everything," he said eventually. "I know. She's falling apart." "Interesting. Not you're falling apart. Her. Always her." I drank slowly before responding. "That sounds difficult." Victor flinched slightly. Good. Not because I enjoyed hurting him, because for once he was finally hearing emotional indifference instead of rescue. "You think I'm a monster," he whispered. I looked at him carefully. My younger brother. The boy I protected after Dad drank too much. The teenager I defended during school fights. The grown man I repeatedly saved from financial collapse. And somewhere along the way, he slept with my wife for over a decade. "No," I said honestly. "I think you're weak." That landed harder than anger could have. Victor looked down immediately. "I loved her." The sentence echoed strangely inside the room, not because it sounded false, because it sounded sincere. That was the horrifying part. Real feelings do not magically erase immoral actions. Sometimes they simply make betrayal more destructive. "You loved access to her," I replied quietly. "That's different." He shook his head. "You don't understand." I laughed softly then, a tired old man's laugh. "No," I said. "You spent years making sure I didn't." Silence filled the kitchen. Then Victor spoke again. "She was lonely. So was I. That marriage died years ago. Then she should have ended it." His jaw tightened. "You make everything sound simple." Interesting accusation from a man who complicated other people's lives for 12 years. I stared at him for a long moment. "You know what the difference is between us, Victor?" He said nothing. "When life disappointed me," I paused. "I endured it." Rain moved harder against the windows suddenly. "When life disappointed you," I continued, "you searched for someone else's stability to crawl inside." His face hardened briefly. "You think you were some perfect husband?" "No." That answer surprised him. I leaned against the counter slowly. I was absent, exhausted. emotionally buried in responsibility. Victor remained silent. But I never betrayed anyone to escape myself. The room went still after that. Because beneath every affair sits another truth people avoid discussing. Betrayal is often less about passion than emotional cowardice. Victor looked toward the dark window above the sink. "She said you stopped seeing her." I nodded faintly, and she stopped seeing me. For the first time all night, Victor had no response, because somewhere deep down, he knew he had entered an already starving marriage and fed on what remained. Then something occurred to me suddenly. I looked toward him carefully. "Why did you call Harold?" His face changed immediately. There it was, the real panic underneath everything. "I just wanted to understand what was happening." "No," I said quietly. "You wanted to understand what you might lose." Victor stepped forward defensively. "That's not fair." "Isn't it?" He rubbed his forehead hard. "Jesus Christ, Daniel." Interesting. People always invoke morality once financial consequences appear. I walked into the living room slowly. "You know what hurts most?" I asked. Victor didn't answer. "You could have had anyone else." He stared at me silently. "There are billions of women on this planet," I continued. "And somehow, you still chose the one person guaranteed to destroy this family." Victor's voice cracked slightly then. "It wasn't supposed to happen." Another useless sentence. Affairs are cemeteries built from supposed to. I sat down heavily in the recliner facing the lake. Victor remained standing. Eventually, he spoke again. "She really did love you." I closed my eyes briefly. "Then why does everyone who loves me eventually start calculating what they can take?" That silenced him completely. The clock near the fireplace ticked softly. Outside, fog drifted low across the water. Then Victor said something unexpected. "She wanted to tell you after your surgery." I opened my eyes slowly. "What?" "She said the guilt was killing her." My chest tightened faintly. "And yet somehow, she survived 12 more years." Victor looked genuinely miserable now. Good. Again, not cruelty, just consequence finally becoming visible. "She thought you'd collapse," he admitted quietly. "Interesting. So she protected me by lying for over a decade?" "No," Victor whispered. "She protected herself." There it was, finally, the first honest sentence all night. I studied my brother carefully, and for the first time since discovering everything, I saw how small he actually was emotionally. Not evil, just profoundly weak. The kind of weakness that feeds on stronger people while quietly resenting them for being strong enough to carry burdens honestly. Then my eyes drifted toward the staircase, toward the upstairs bedroom, the bed they used, the room where my marriage quietly rotted while I paid property taxes and repaired leaking pipes and kept everyone financially afloat. I stood slowly. Victor looked alarmed immediately. "What are you doing?" "Going upstairs." "Daniel." I started climbing the staircase carefully. My knees protested with every step. Halfway up, I stopped and looked back down at him. "You know the worst part?" Victor stared up silently. "I would have forgiven almost anything except the disrespect." Then I continued upstairs toward the bedroom neither of them had ever truly understood they were destroying. And when I entered it, I noticed something sitting on the nightstand beside the bed. A photograph, face down, recently placed there. The photograph was old. I knew that before I even turned it over. Pictures age differently than people do. The corners soften, colors fade. Time settles into the paper like dust into floorboards. I picked it up carefully. Summer, 1981. Clara and me standing beside this same lake. Newly married, 26 years old. Poor, hopeful. Back when love still looked simple enough to survive honesty. On the back, written in Clara's handwriting, were 4 words. Before we disappeared. I stared at the sentence for a very long time. Then I sat slowly on the edge of the bed that had held too many versions of my life. Victor remained downstairs, silent now, probably waiting for another emotional collapse he could react to instead of prevent. That had always been his way. The rain finally stopped completely sometime after midnight. The lake outside turned black and still beneath the fog. And for the first time in days, I allowed myself to stop thinking about betrayal. Not forgive it, not excuse it, just stop carrying it for a moment. Because exhaustion eventually reaches a place where even grief becomes too heavy to hold continuously. I looked around the bedroom quietly. The old lamp near the dresser, the crack in the ceiling I never repaired. The curtains Clara picked 20 years earlier because she said the pale blue reminded her of calm water. Strange what survives after love dies. Objects remain loyal longer than people do. Around 1 a.m, Victor knocked softly on the open bedroom door. "Daniel?" I looked toward him. He seemed smaller now somehow. Older. "What?" He hesitated, then placed the lake house key gently on the dresser beside the door. "I'm leaving." I nodded once. He stood there awkwardly for another second, like he wanted absolution. I had none left to give him. Finally, he whispered, "I really am sorry." Then he walked away. A few moments later, I heard the front door close downstairs. And after that, only silence remained. Real silence this time. Not hidden conversations, not careful lies, not emotional negotiations happening underneath ordinary family dinners. Just silence. I stayed at the lake house 3 more days. No phone calls answered, no explanations, no rescue work. The strange thing about withdrawing from people emotionally is how quickly they realize how much invisible labor you were performing all along. By the 2nd day, Michael left 3 voicemails. Not angry, just lost. By the 3rd day, Andrew sent messages every few hours asking if I was okay. Funny. For years, nobody asked that question while I was funding their lives and swallowing my exhaustion quietly. Distance teaches people what presence was costing you. Clara called 14 times. I listened to none of them. Not to punish her, because I finally understood something that took me 71 years to learn. Love without boundaries eventually becomes permission. And I had spent decades giving everyone permission to consume me emotionally while calling it devotion. On the 4th morning, I woke before sunrise and walked down to the dock alone. Fog drifted low across the lake. Everything looked unfinished. I wore my father's old wristwatch for the first time in years. The leather strap was cracked now, the ticking faint but steady. He used to tell me that men mistake endurance for purpose. I never understood what he meant until I became old enough to realize surviving something is not the same as living through it honestly. I sat at the edge of the dock, watching light slowly emerge across the water. And somewhere during that quiet morning, I stopped feeling angry. Not because what happened became smaller, because I finally saw it clearly. Clara did not betray me because I was unlovable. Victor did not betray me because I was weak. My children did not fail me because I lacked value. They failed because human beings grow comfortable inside sacrifice they never had to earn. That is the danger of becoming the emotional foundation for everyone around you. People stop seeing the weight once you carry it long enough. By noon, I drove back home. The house looked exactly the same from outside. That almost made me laugh. People imagine betrayal changes everything visibly. Usually, it only changes the meaning of ordinary things. Clara opened the front door before I even reached it. She looked exhausted, older, not performatively broken, actually broken. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then she whispered, "I thought you weren't coming back." I looked past her into the hallway. The photograph wall was still there, the clock still ticking, the house still standing. But something fundamental had ended here. Not suddenly, years ago. We had simply been living inside the delay. "I came back for my things," I said quietly. Her face collapsed completely. And strangely enough, that was the moment I pitied her most. Not because she lost me, because she finally understood what she traded away, piece by piece, while convincing herself she still had time left to repair it. Over the following months, everything changed slowly. No dramatic courtroom scenes, no screaming matches, no public revenge. Just quiet removal. The trusts remained altered. The estate transferred permanently. The financial access everyone assumed would exist forever disappeared carefully and legally. Michael eventually apologized for not seeing how exhausted I'd become over the years. Andrew cried the day I refused another loan. Really cried. Not for money. For the first time in his life, he understood I would no longer destroy myself to protect him from adulthood. Victor moved 2 states away after Clara ended things with him permanently. Apparently, fantasy collapses quickly once reality demands ordinary mornings. And Clara? Clara became a stranger I once loved very deeply. We spoke occasionally during the divorce process, mostly practical things. Paperwork, property, memories divided into boxes. 42 years reduced to signatures and careful politeness. That's the cruel truth about aging. You spend decades building a life before discovering how fragile emotional architecture really is. The final time I saw Clara was 8 months later. She came to the lake house unexpectedly while I was repairing part of the dock before winter. Gray sky, cold wind, dead leaves moving across the water. She stood beside me quietly for a while before speaking. "I used to think you'd always be there. I kept working. I know." Tears filled her eyes then. Not dramatic, not manipulative. Just grief arriving too late to matter. "You were the best man I ever knew," she whispered. I looked out across the lake for a long time before answering. "No," I said softly. "I was just the man who stayed." She cried harder after that, because both of us finally understood the same terrible thing at the exact same moment. Staying is only noble when the people around you still remember you're human. Eventually, Clara left. I watched her car disappear slowly through the trees until only silence remained again. Then I sat alone on the unfinished dock as evening settled over the lake. The old wristwatch ticked softly against my skin. Water moved beneath the wood. Somewhere far away, thunder rolled quietly beyond the hills. And for the first time in my entire life,
There was nobody left leaning on me.
The loneliness of that realization should have broken me. Instead, it felt strangely peaceful. Because empty rooms hurt less once you stop expecting love to walk back into them. The last light disappeared slowly across the water, and in the growing darkness, the lake house finally became honest enough to match my life.